Now is Karen Kwiatkowski. She is a retired lieutenant colonel with the U.S. Air Force and worked at the Pentagon and the U.S. National Security Agency. From New York, we're joined by Peter Van Buren. He served as a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. State Department and is a well-known author and commentator. Also with us in Washington is former U.S. Ambassador to Morocco, Mark Ginsburg. He's a senior U.S. diplomat who traveled to Iraq to assess the insurgency and the pace there of reconstruction. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's start with 1961, with that warning from Eisenhower about the threat that faced the United States, the military-industrial complex. Peter Van Buren, when we look at the size of the military budget today, when we look at the arms exports, when we look at this army of lobbyists, right here in Washington, who make sure that that budget is not reduced, was Eisenhower right?
Eisenhower was remarkably prescient. He saw what was coming, a combination of political factors, of industrial organizations that were dependent solely on the government as their only customer making weapons, banding together to ensure there will always be a market for those weapons. Eisenhower's time, that market was primarily in the United States, the American government buying weapons for the American military. What's happened since that time is a morphing, an increase in that market, so that the United States now not only spends more money than other countries on weapons and so-called defense, but also exports more weapons around the world. Those weapons proliferate, those weapons find their way onto battlefields they were never intended to be on, and at times, such as in Iraq right now, those weapons are often dangerously turned against our own troops or our own interests. I think if Eisenhower were alive today, he would be shocked at how right he was and how wrong the system has become.
Karen, what do you make of that this mass proliferation of weapons, this huge export of weapons from the United States and the wars that it's fighting in other countries around the world, actually has led to the world actually being flooded with weapons?
True, and the United States has created a marketplace. It discovered a marketplace. Maybe it started domestically, but we have created a combination of policy, diplomacy, or lack thereof, and aggressive marketing. We've created markets that now sustain these jobs, and the Iron Triangle is still there.
Ambassador Ginsburg, since, I was looking at some figures, since 1776, 239 years ago, the United States has been at war at least 214 years of those 239 years. So has it got to the stage now in the country where war is actually business as usual for the U.S.?
Well, I'm going to be somewhat contrarian because the fact of the matter is that we all hoped that there was going to be a peace dividend with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there was great expectation that Eisenhower's warning would have shall we say, been heeded as a result of events. And the fact of the matter is that when President Obama, in his last several inaugural addresses, his inaugural address as well as his State of the Unions, he expressed a desire to rein in the budget of the military and to, in effect, pare down the military. And now we're watching this right now, a big struggle over the budget. Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, is having to contend with a smaller budget, and yet at the same time, as was referenced by my colleague in New York, the fact of the matter is that there's huge weaponizations that is occurring on acquisition programs because Congress is forcing the Pentagon to perpetuate this so-called military-industrial complex, even though the U.S. executive branch is trying to rein in some of these weapons acquisition programs. So you not only have, in effect, conflicts that have proliferated, you also have a breakdown of comity between Congress and the administration over the Pentagon's budget.
Peter, earlier on when you were talking to us, you talked about so-called defense. I mean, what about the argument that the U.S. needs this global presence for its own national security?
Well, there are times when countries do need to defend themselves. There's no question about that. But one has to go back and take a look at some of the United States' larger military actions. For example, since World War II, the most recent one to point to, of course, would be the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Before that, the massive U.S. intervention in Vietnam, and some of the smaller ones along the way, and ask the question of what U.S. national interests were threatened, and certainly the question of whether America itself was threatened. That's why I put the word defense in quotes. I think it's important to remember that prior to World War II, and in fact during World War II, the Pentagon was known as the War Department. Defense is simply kind of a newspeak term that emerged in the aftermath of World War II, and like many of those terms, it really doesn't represent the reality of America's aggressive posture overseas, particularly as a proliferator of weapons.
Karen, if we look at it another way, if we take away national security, if we take away defense, and we look at the arms industry as a business, is it now a business that's got so big that the entire economy is dependent on it?
A good segment of the economy is dependent on it, and certainly here in D.C., if you listen to the radio, the ads, it's defense, defense, defense. It's Boeing, it's Raytheon, it is the other contractors that serve the Pentagon. I mean, they mean jobs. It's part of a culture. It really has become that.
Ambassador, the other argument we hear from the United States, from those who advocate United States involvement in other countries, is that in many instances the United States does this for humanitarian concerns, as we heard with the intervention in Libya. The opposite side of that, as we hear from the left in this country, is that the United States is just, it's American imperialism. It's just the United States trying to build an empire.
You know, I'm well familiar with the argumentation, and yet at the same time, we've made our share of mistakes. But just look at the situation in the Middle East right now, which is my area of expertise. The Arab states that are most affected and most endangered as a result of the spread of ISIS have yet to put the very military boots on the ground, so to speak, that would relieve the United States of the necessity of, in effect, leading this coalition of NATO states and Arab states against ISIS, as well as to retrain Iraqi troops and to engage in the level of hostilities. And it begs the question, of course. It's not that any of us want to see American boots on the ground and expansion of American involvement in this conflict, which is largely an Arab conflict. But at what point in time do we basically say it's important for Arab states to stand up? And just look at the NATO budgets of other countries. We have been engaged in this constant battle with our strongest NATO allies to meet what essentially were common budget requirements for defense spending. We are way up here, as you said, and yet Great Britain, France, and Germany have nowhere near matched the required spending that is necessary to be a NATO member on good standing. And we have, in effect, either relieved them of that responsibility, or because of the fact that it's in our own pecuniary interest to, in effect, be that large budget manager of the NATO budget, we have not forced them to step up to the plate.
All right, Peter, is that the problem here, as our reporter pointed out in his piece at the beginning of the show, that the United States has effectively taken over the duties of all these other countries which have reduced their defense budgets and become the world's policeman?
Well, it's an interesting question, and referring back to the ambassador's statement about the Arab countries not stepping up in the battle against ISIS, certainly there are a couple of ways to look at that. One of them, of course, is that if the United States is willing to fight these battles, sure, the other countries will step back and allow us to do that. The other spin, however, is to ask the question of, do the battles truly need to be fought? If the countries that are closest to the ISIS problem, if you will, if the countries that are most directly affected by ISIS are not stepping up, that leaves open the question of whether, in fact, there really is an issue that needs to be addressed in this way at this level. The same for NATO. When the threat was the Soviet Union and NATO actually had a true purpose, I think the other countries participated, perhaps not at the same levels as the United States, but they didn't bring the same resources as background. But as NATO finds itself more and more an artifact of a Cold War that hasn't existed for a while, and the United States finds itself the leader of a coalition that largely doesn't exist, you have to sort of ask the question of, what are we, in fact, supporting here? Is there really a problem? Is there really a nail that needs to be hammered down? Or is the United States, in fact, engaged in something else? And that something else gets into those questions about empire that you had raised earlier.
Karen, is that the situation here? The United States has actually created a situation where it needs to be in a place.
Well, we've created a situation that we call ourselves the world's policeman, but I think you also have to look at effectiveness. I mean, have we policed anything? Have we brought peace anywhere that our troops have been? We haven't. We have not been successful. We're not, I think the market is not to be successful. The market is to create spending, to create replenishment of the military items that we've purchased. and to maintain that forward activism. And if you call it empire, you know, we don't do empire, but what we do is we create markets for one of the biggest industries in this country.
Ambassador, I want to get your answer to that. Has the United States policed anything? But first, we're going to have to take a break. When we come